The last thing I wrote in my logbook before I stopped writing altogether was this: Table 6. 3:17 a.m. He ordered the same thing again. But tonight, he was already there when I arrived. And I have the only key. I've been sitting with that sentence for 3 months now. I've reread it probably 100 times. And every time I do, I feel the same thing I felt standing in that parking lot at the start of my shift, staring at the back of his head through the glass. That specific, stomach-deep variety of wrong that doesn't have a clean name in any language I know. Not fear exactly. Not confusion exactly. Something that sits between those two things and refuses to leave. I'm going to tell you what happened at Milo's 24-hour diner over the 4 months I worked there. I'm going to be as accurate as I can, even about the parts one don't fully understand. Especially about those parts. Some of what I describe is going to sound like coincidence, or like I was stressed and sleep-deprived and reading too much into ordinary things. Maybe. I've considered that. I've considered it more times than I can count. But there's a point in this story where coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation, and I think you'll recognize that point when we reach it. I won't need to tell you. I took the job because I needed money and I needed something to do between midnight and 8 in the morning that wasn't lying in my apartment staring at the ceiling. I'd been through something, a breakup, a job loss, the specific kind of unhinging that comes when two major things collapse at the same time, and I needed structure. I needed somewhere to be. The overnight shift at a diner is, in a lot of ways, the perfect job for someone in that condition. The work is repetitive enough to be almost meditative. The hours belong to a separate world. You start to feel like you exist in a different time layer than everyone you know, and for a while, that felt like relief rather than isolation. Milo's was a perfectly ordinary diner on the edge of a small town in central Ohio, the kind of place that has been there forever and looks it, with vinyl booth cushions repaired with mismatched tape and a Bunn coffee maker that gurgled like it was in pain. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that took about a week to stop noticing. The parking lot was cracked and weed stubbled. The sign out front had a burned-out letter so that it read Mills instead of Milo's, and nobody fixed it in the entire time I worked there. I remember thinking that was charming at first. I remember a lot of things feeling charming at first. I was hired by a woman named Dina, who was the night manager and had worked there for 11 years. She showed me around on my first day, the walk-in cooler, the prep stations, the side alley where we kept the extra grease bins, and she did it with the clipped efficiency of someone who has given the same tour so many times that the words have lost all meaning. She answered every question I asked. She answered them completely and correctly. But there was a quality to her answers that I couldn't identify at the time, and only understood later. She answered like someone who had been trained to answer. Like someone who had been told what to say and had been saying it for so long that the trained version had replaced any more authentic version that might have existed underneath. The overnight crew was small. Dina, myself, a cook named Warren who spoke maybe 40 words per shift and produced excellent eggs, and a dishwasher named Priya who wore headphones constantly and nodded at things nobody had said. We coexisted in a comfortable, minimal way. The overnight diner has its own ecosystem. You learn it quickly. The customers were what you'd expect: truckers, insomniacs, people coming off second shifts at the factory 2 miles down the road, the occasional university student with a laptop and hollow eyes. A rotating, semi-familiar cast that cycled through without demanding much attention. You learned their orders. You learned which ones wanted conversation and which ones wanted to be invisible. You learned the rhythms. He arrived on my 3rd night. I didn't think anything of it then. He came in at around 2 a.m., sat at table 6, which was the corner booth farthest from the door, and ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. He ate slowly. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't read anything. He sat facing the room with his hands folded on the table, and he looked at something in the middle distance that I couldn't locate. He left a precise $4 tip. Cash. He was there when I arrived at midnight on my 4th night. And my 5th. And every single night after that for the next 4 months. It was Warren who said something first, 3 weeks in. He said it without looking up from the grill, in the same flat tone he used for everything. "He here yet?" I said yes. Warren nodded like I'd confirmed a weather forecast. I thought about asking what he meant by that. I didn't. And that night, taking my break in the break room at 4 a.m., I flipped back through the weeks in my memory trying to identify when, exactly, I had stopped registering the man at table 6 as unusual. Trying to figure out how he had become simply he, a pronoun without introduction, a permanent feature of the room, without anyone ever saying his name, or acknowledging that something about this was strange. I couldn't find the moment it had happened. I still can't. And that gap in my own awareness bothered me more than the man himself. At least at first. Section 2, Routine and Subtle Wrongness. The overnight shift at a diner has a texture that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't worked one. It's not quiet exactly. There's always the hum of equipment, the grease spit from the grill, the low television in the corner that Dina kept on a local access channel nobody watched. But there's a particular quality to the noise that feels like a kind of silence. Like the building is maintaining itself. Like the sounds are structural rather than incidental. My routine solidified quickly. Clock in at 11:50. Brew the first fresh pot. Check the side station, napkins, sugar caddies, condiments. Do a walk of the dining room to make sure the previous shift had cleared everything properly. They usually hadn't cleared table 6 properly. There was always something left there, a ring from a coffee cup, a smear on the window, a napkin not quite pushed into its holder. I cleaned it the same way every night without thinking about why it bothered me. Dina gave me the logbook on my first week. Every diner has a version of this, a shift record where you note customer counts, any incidents, supply levels, anything maintenance related. Standard stuff. She showed me the format, date, time in and out, customer count per hour, notes. The notes section was the part that interested me, because the previous entries told a kind of story in miniature. Spilled coffee. Light in men's room flickering. Delivery of wrong syrup. And then, scattered throughout without emphasis or apparent significance, entries like T6 present, full shift. Sometimes just T6. Going back months. Going back, as far as I could tell, to the beginning of the logbook itself, which was dated 14 months prior. The handwriting changed across entries. At least 4 different people had maintained this book, but the T6 notation appeared in every single hand. I asked Dina about it. She was restocking the pastry case, and she didn't pause. "That's just for tracking regular customers," she said. "Inventory purposes." I asked why table 6 specifically warranted its own notation when no other table did. She closed the pastry case. She turned and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. "He's a consistent customer," she said. "We note consistent customers." I wrote that down in my personal notebook that night, not the logbook, my own notebook, because something about her answer had the same quality as her orientation to her. Correct. Complete. Empty. The reporting procedures were the first thing that felt genuinely unusual rather than just mildly odd. Every diner has some version of incident reporting, health and safety stuff, mostly liability adjacent. But Milo's had a form I hadn't seen anywhere else. A double-sided laminated card in the break room labeled Shift Anomaly Protocol, printed in the same dated font as the fire evacuation plan and treated with the same casual permanence. It listed a series of scenarios and the appropriate responses. Most of them were ordinary: customer altercation, medical emergency, equipment failure. But there were 3 at the bottom of the second side that I read 3 times before I was sure I understood them correctly. Environmental irregularity, temperature drop exceeding standard HVAC variance. Do not adjust thermostat. Note time and duration in logbook. Do not discuss with customers. Customer behavioral anomaly, defined as repetitive action, fixed gaze, non-responsive state. Do not intervene. Note table number and duration in logbook. Contact manager on duty. Exterior perimeter. Do not exit building between 3 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. without manager authorization during any period of service disruption. I read that last one several times. Service disruption wasn't defined anywhere on the card. When I asked Dina, she said it was a liability thing. Insurance language. She said the hours were related to a previous incident involving a slip and fall in the parking lot. I noted it in my personal notebook. Slip and fall. Warren never commented on the form. Priya, when I showed it to her one night, read it, nodded once, put her headphones back in. Nobody found it interesting except me. And I understand now that this is the thing about institutional wrongness. The way it becomes invisible through repetition, through the accumulated weight of everyone around you treating it as normal. You start to doubt your own perception. You start to think that the strangeness you're detecting is a personal malfunction rather than an accurate reading of the environment. This is, I think now, exactly how it's supposed to work. I started paying attention to the temperature. I started keeping my own readings in my notebook, separate from the logbook, noting the time every time I felt the dining room go cold. It happened most nights between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. Not every night. Maybe 4 nights out of 7. The drop was genuine. You could see it in the condensation on the windows, could feel it in the way the coffee in your hand lost heat faster than it should. Once I checked the thermostat, and it read 68 degrees while I could see my breath faintly in the air below the counter. I logged it in the logbook as instructed. Temperature irregularity, 2:47 a.m. When I came in the next night, the entry was gone. Not erased. The page had been replaced. The handwriting around it was mine, but that line was absent, and the entries above and below it had been recopied so cleanly that I would have thought I'd imagined writing it if I hadn't also written it in my personal notebook. The man at table 6 never seemed affected by the temperature drops. He sat with his hands folded and his coffee going cold, and he watched the middle distance. Every night. Same booth. Same order. Same $4 tip in exact cash that he had arranged on the table before I ever brought the bill. I began to wonder, very quietly and with what I told myself was rational detachment, whether he was leaving before I arrived or whether he was somehow there when I arrived. The parking lot had 2 entrances. The diner had a back door through the kitchen. I started paying closer attention to the timestamps of my arrivals versus the timestamps in the logbook of his first logged presence per shift. The numbers didn't line up in a way I could explain. But it was Priya who said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. She said it while we were both on break, at the small table in the back room with the blinking exit sign and the smell of old dish soap and steam. She said it without looking up from her phone, in the same absent tone she used for everything. "Don't try to figure out when he gets here," she said. "That's not really the question." I asked her what the question was. She put her headphones back in. Section 3. Pattern recognition. The human mind is exceptionally good at normalizing things it encounters repeatedly. This is, I think, a survival mechanism. The brain conserves attention by flagging novelty and releasing things that have occurred without consequence multiple times. I think about this a lot now. I think about how much of what I experienced at Milo's I had already begun to normalize before I consciously recognized it as wrong. The temperature drops. The logbook replacements. The man at table 6 with his folded hands and his $4 tip and his precise, patient stillness. I began keeping time in a different way. Not just noting anomalies but noting my own responses to them. Whether I had felt something and ignored it. Whether there were stretches of the shift I couldn't account for with the same clarity as others. This started as a discipline and turned, over a week or 2, into something closer to a compulsion. The first memory inconsistency I documented happened on a Tuesday in my 5th week. I was certain, absolutely clearly certain, that the man at table 6 had ordered pie and coffee, as always, and that I had brought him the pie. I remember the weight of the plate. I remember placing it in front of him and noticing, as I sometimes did, that he didn't look at it when it arrived. He was already looking at whatever point in the middle distance held his attention. I remember returning to the counter. I remember the next time I looked at table 6, which I estimated was about 15 minutes later. The pie was gone and the plate was clean and he was sitting with his hands folded and his coffee cup positioned differently than I remembered. I noted that and thought nothing of it beyond mild puzzlement. But when I checked the logbook that night, I had started logging his orders as precisely as possible. I had written pie plus coffee, T6, 2:14 a.m. The plate return time I noted was 3:01 a.m. 47 minutes? A piece of pie does not take 47 minutes, but more relevantly, I had no memory of 47 minutes. I had a memory of 15. I stood with the logbook open for a long moment in the hum of the fluorescent kitchen lights, and I listened to Warren behind me scraping the grill, and I waited for something to make sense of the gap. Nothing did. The radio was the second thing. Milo's kept an old FM radio on the shelf above the back counter, a plastic unit with a telescoping antenna that had been bent and straightened so many times it stood at an angle. It was tuned, always, to a local station that played a mix of light rock and country and advertisements for local businesses. Normal background texture. But I started noticing that between certain hours, specifically, between 3 a.m. and 3:40 a.m. on certain nights, the station would develop a kind of interference. Not static exactly. Something more textural than static. It had a rhythm to it that made me think, uncomfortably, of breathing. Not like a person breathing. More like a large, slow, pressurized system cycling. Like the sound of air moving through something very big. I mentioned the radio interference to Dina once. She looked at the radio. She said the antenna needed adjusting. She didn't adjust it. I noticed she never stood near the radio during those hours. The outside sound started in my 6th week. This requires some context. The diner was not in a silent location. The road out front carried occasional truck traffic. There was a grain facility about half a mile away that ran night operations. Environmental sound was a constant. I had catalogued it well enough that I could identify most sources without thinking. The sound I started hearing during certain nights was not from the road and was not from the grain facility, and was not from the HVAC system. It came from outside the north wall of the diner, the wall without windows, the one that faced the empty lot, and then the tree line about 200 yards back. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, continuous, almost subaudible pressure. Like sound felt through the floor rather than heard through the air. It lasted, when it occurred, for somewhere between 6 and 22 minutes. It always stopped before 4 a.m. Warren heard it too. I know because I watched him. On the nights it was present, he became still in a particular way. His movements at the grill would slow and then stop, and he would stand with his back to the room and his head slightly lowered, and he would stay that way until the sound stopped. Then he would resume work without comment. I watched this happen 4 times before I said anything. I said, "Warren, you hear that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hear what?" he said. Flat. Not a question. "That sound. Outside. Through the wall." He scraped the grill. "Equipment at the lot," he said. "Runs on a cycle." I wrote that down. Equipment at the lot. Runs on a cycle. I put a star next to it because I had already checked. The grain facility's night operations ran west of the building, not north. The north lot had been empty for 3 years. I'd seen it on a county map I'd found online. There was nothing north of the diner but the lot and the tree line, and beyond that, eventually, a dry creek bed. I sat with that for a long time. On the 3rd night I heard the sound through the north wall. I watched a man at table 6. He was sitting in his usual position, hands folded, gaze on the middle distance. But as the sound intensified slightly, and it did intensify, gently, over the course of those minutes, I watched his hands slowly unfold. He placed his palms flat on the table. He turned his head, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for permission, and he looked directly at the north wall. For the duration of the sound. Just looked at it. When it stopped, he folded his hands again, returned his gaze to the middle distance, and picked up his coffee cup. I was standing behind the counter with a coffee pot in my hand, and I realized that my hand was shaking. Not from fear, I told myself. From the cold. The temperature had dropped again. My breath was faintly visible. The clock above the counter read 3:31 a.m. I looked at the logbook. Someone had written in the notes section, in handwriting that was not mine, T6. Responsive. No time. No one else was in the front of the house. Warren was in the kitchen. Priya was in the back. Dina was in her office. The pen was on the counter beside the logbook. It was warm, as though it had just been set down. Section 4. The Hidden System. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I am aware of how it sounds. I am aware that what I am about to describe, a person quietly investigating their own workplace, finding files that shouldn't exist, reaching conclusions that sound like paranoia, follows a recognizable shape. I am aware that this shape exists in stories. What I want you to understand is that I was aware of this shape at the time, too, and it didn't help me. Knowing the shape of a thing does not change the thing. I started looking after the logbook entry. I started slowly, with what I told myself was controlled curiosity rather than anything more urgent. I began arriving a few minutes early to my shift, not conspicuously early, just enough time to have a look at things before Dina arrived or Warren set up the grill. I looked at things I had previously taken for granted: the layout of the back rooms, the filing structure under the counter, the storage areas I hadn't fully explored in my first few weeks. Milo's was old enough to have accumulated a sedimentary quality, layers of previous eras of operation visible in the structure of the building. There were shelves behind the main storage room that held equipment from at least 2 generations back, old laminate menus sealed in rubber bands, a credit card and printer nobody had used since the 90s, boxes of thermal paper for receipt printers long since replaced. I went through these carefully and without expectation, and I found mostly what I expected to find, which was institutional detritus. The accumulated debris of a business operating for decades. The secondary storage room was what interested me. It was off the hallway between the kitchen and the break room, a door I had assumed led to a utility closet, and had never opened because it was always closed and nobody had included it in my orientation. I tried it on a slow Wednesday night at around 4 a.m., and it was unlocked. It was a room about the size of a large closet, which is essentially what it was: shelving on 3 walls, a single overhead bulb on a pull chain, the smell of old paper and something damp and mineral underneath. The shelves held binders. There were perhaps 40 binders in total, uniformly gray, labeled with date ranges in black marker. The earliest was from 1987. The most recent ended 8 months ago, which was before I had started working there. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I pulled one down. The binders were not what I expected. They were not HR records or health inspection files or inventory logs. They were observation records. Dense, handwritten tables of data with column headers that I had to read several times to parse. Date, arrival time, duration, temperature delta, audio event Y/N, T6 response, perimeter observation, staff response, anomaly grade. The anomaly grade column used a scale from 0 to 4. Most entries read 1 or 2. Occasionally, 3. I found 2 entries graded 4. Both were accompanied by sheets of paper clipped inside the binder cover, typed summaries, slightly formal in language, with the header internal incident notation, not for external filing. Both summaries described events I will return to later. What I noticed first was not the content of the summaries but the authorship. Both were signed, and the signatures were from staff members who were not Dina and were not Warren and were not the names in the employment records I'd glanced at behind the counter. They were names I didn't recognize. I pulled a binder from 4 years ago and found 2 of the same names. I pulled a binder from 7 years ago and found 1 of them. I pulled the oldest binder, 1987, water-stained, the cover soft with age, and I found a name I had not expected. The signature at the bottom of an incident notation from December of that year was M. Holst, and the name on the small framed photograph on Dina's office wall, the one of a man in a cook's apron standing in front of the diner, was Milo Holst, 1978 to 2003. He had been keeping records of T6 since 1987. Since at least 1987. The binder that year was not the first, it was labeled Volume 3. I stood in that storage room with the binder open and the pull chain light swinging slightly from a draft I couldn't locate the source of, and I tried to do the arithmetic of what I was looking at. The same table. The same documentation protocol. The same column headers, copied precisely from one binder to the next across nearly 4 decades. Multiple staff. Multiple managers. All maintaining the same records, in the same format, about the same table and the same unacknowledged presence. I was so absorbed in the arithmetic that I almost missed what was on the shelf behind me. I turned to put the binder back and I saw it, a newer binder, not gray but black, positioned on the bottom shelf partially behind a box of old menus. No date range on the spine. Just my name. My first name, written in black marker, in handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it. There were 6 pages inside. The first 5 were blank observation forms, the same column headers I'd seen in the other binders, prepared and ready to be filled in. The 6th page was a typed sheet with the same internal incident notation header. It was dated 2 weeks before I had applied for the job. The body of the note read, "Anticipated arrival, 3rd week of month." Background consistent with required profile. No prior institutional exposure. Recommended for monitoring program integration. Standard orientation protocol applies. Do not accelerate timeline. At the bottom, where a signature should have been, there was only a single handwritten line. "She'll find this when she's ready." I put the binder back exactly where I found it. I turned off the light. I closed the door. I walked back to the dining room on legs that felt like they were operating on a slight delay. The man at table 6 was sitting in his usual position. His coffee was full. I did not remember refilling it. Section 5, Escalation. The storm came on a Thursday. I say the storm even though, when I am being precise, I have to acknowledge that what I witnessed over the following 3 days was not a single weather event. It was not gradual, and it was not procedurally normal, and it was not, as far as I have been able to determine from every public meteorological record I have checked since leaving Milo's, recorded anywhere. I want to be precise about this. Central Ohio is not a region without weather. It gets its storms. The area had a reliable local network of weather stations, a National Weather Service office 80 miles south, and the kind of agricultural community that takes weather predictions seriously. I checked NWS archives for that week. I checked 3 separate weather logging services. I found records of a standard low-pressure system passing through the region on Wednesday into Thursday, the kind of front that brings steady rain and some wind and drops the temperature by 15 degrees. Standard. Logged. Named and numbered in the normal way. What arrived Thursday night was not that system. The first sign was the barometric pressure. Milo's had an old analog barometer mounted near the back door, the kind with a brass face and a needle, that had been there long enough to be part of the decor. I had started noting its readings in my personal notebook about 2 weeks earlier, not for any scientific purpose but because I had noticed that the temperature drops in the dining room seemed loosely correlated with drops in barometric pressure. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was consistent enough to track. On Thursday, at 11:40 p.m., the barometer read lower than I had ever seen it. Lower than the scale was marked to measure. The needle was pressed against the lower peg of the gauge. I went into the dining room. The fluorescent lights had developed a flicker I hadn't noticed before, not dramatic, not the movie-style strobe of impending horror, but a subtle, low-frequency oscillation that was just enough to make the light feel unreliable. Like the room was slightly less real than usual. Dina was already in. She was there before me, which was unusual. She typically arrived 20 minutes into my shift. She was standing at the front window looking out at the parking lot. She didn't turn when I came in. "Big one coming," I said by way of conversation. She didn't respond for a moment. Then she said, "Log your arrival time and check all the locks." I said, "All the locks?" "Front, back, and the side service door." I had not known there was a side service door until that moment. She told me it was in the secondary storage hallway, behind the box of old menus. I went and checked it. It was locked, as it turned out, a deadbolt that looked newer than everything else in the building. I confirmed it was secure and came back and logged my arrival time and didn't ask about the door, because I was thinking about the binder with my name on it and trying to decide how much of what I knew I was going to pretend not to know. The man at table 6 arrived at 12:08 a.m. I logged it. He ordered his coffee and pie without looking at the menu, as always, and he settled into his usual position. But something was different on that night, a quality in the air around him, or perhaps in my own perception, that made him feel less like a fixture and more like a presence. More like something that had weight and intention. I don't know how to be more precise than that. Warren was already at the grill. He was cooking nothing, there were no orders, but he was standing at the grill with one hand on the handle of the spatula, oriented toward the work surface, perfectly still. Like a person waiting for something. At 1:15 a.m. the power fluctuated for the first time. Not an outage, the lights stayed on, the equipment stayed running, but a pressure change in the electricity, if that phrase makes any sense, that you could feel through the floor and through the handles of metal objects. I was holding the coffee pot when it happened and I put it down. At 1:47 a.m., 2 of the 3 trucks that had been parked in the lot when I arrived left simultaneously, backing out without the drivers coming inside for a bill or a word, which was unusual. I watched them go through the front window. Their tail lights disappeared south on the road and the parking lot became very empty. The television in the corner, which had been running its usual low-volume local access feed, cut to static at 2 a.m. exactly. Not the fuzzy analog static of a lost signal, a specific, textured, rhythmic static that I recognized from the FM radio. The same rhythm. The same pressurized, cycling quality. I reached for the remote to change the channel. Dina, who was behind me, said, "Leave it." I left it. At 2:30 a.m., the man at table 6 placed both palms flat on the table and turned his head toward the north wall. There was no sound through the wall yet, or at least, no sound I could consciously detect. But he was already looking at it. He looked at it for 11 minutes by my watch. His coffee sat untouched. The pie was untouched. He breathed. I could see the movement of his shoulders, but otherwise he was entirely still. At 2:41 a.m., every clock in the diner stopped simultaneously. I noticed because I was watching the one above the counter. It stopped. I looked at my watch, which is battery operated. It had stopped too. I pulled out my phone. The phone's clock was still running, but the time it showed, and I wrote this down immediately, did not match the time that had been on the wall clock when it stopped. There was a gap of 23 minutes that I could not account for. I had no memory of 23 minutes. I looked at the man at table 6. He had turned back to the room. He was looking at me. It was the first time, in all the weeks I had watched him, that I had seen him look directly at another person. His expression was not frightening. It was not hostile. It was the expression of a person waiting patiently for someone to understand something they have been trying to communicate for a very long time. Then the sound through the north wall began, and it was not the low subaudible pressure I had come to know. It was something else entirely. Something that I am going to need more space to describe accurately. And outside, through the front windows, the sky was doing something that no sky in central Ohio had any meteorological reason to do. Section 6. Survival Procedures. What the sky was doing was this: it was wrong in a way that was initially difficult to categorize. Not dramatically wrong, not green tornado sky or blood-red horizon. Wrong in the way a face is wrong when the proportions are almost but not entirely correct. The cloud layer was too low. Not storm low or fog low, but geometrically low, as if the ceiling of the atmosphere had descended several hundred feet and was sitting over the town with the patient weight of something deliberate. The clouds were not moving. In a storm system, in any weather system of any kind, clouds move. These clouds were static, fixed overhead like a ceiling. I stood at the front window and looked at it, and felt the particular species of wrong that I had felt on my third night, standing in the parking lot staring at the back of the man's head. The stomach-deep variety with no clean name. Dina came and stood beside me. She looked out for a moment. Then she said, "Okay. We're going to procedure 4. I had learned by then not to ask what things meant in the way a normal new employee might, because the answers were always the technically correct non-answers of someone reciting from a script. Instead, I asked what she needed me to do. She handed me a laminated card I had never seen before. Different from the shift anomaly protocol in the break room. This one was printed on yellow stock and titled Extended Operations Protocol, Level 4. It was a checklist. The first items were sensible: secure all exterior doors, disable non-essential appliances, move perishables to secondary cold storage, confirm headcount, standard emergency management language. But the list continued beyond what emergency management would require. Remove all reflective surfaces from customer-facing areas. Close and secure all interior doors except primary service corridor. Reduce interior lighting to minimum functional level. Maintain continuous audio monitoring of north perimeter. Document any changes in frequency, duration, or pattern. Do not allow any staff or customer to approach within 3 meters of the north wall. If T6 occupant exhibits Phase 2 behavior, do not interact. Maintain standard service only. Log all behavioral changes at 2-minute intervals. That last item had a subscript at the bottom of the card in smaller type. Phase 2 behavior defined as direct perimeter orientation lasting more than 8 minutes, bilateral palm contact with table surface, vocalization directed at north wall, or standing from table position. I read it twice. I looked up at Dina. I was trying to maintain the expression of someone performing a professional task. She said, "Start with the mirrors in the restrooms. There's a cloth in the supply closet to cover them." I went to the supply closet. On the second shelf, neatly folded, were 2 pieces of dark cloth, exactly the right size to cover the mirrors in the men's and women's restrooms. Pre-folded. Already there. As though they had been waiting. Warren had begun moving through the kitchen with the efficient calm of someone executing a drill he had performed many times. He was unplugging the hood fans, lowering the grill to its minimum, moving with his head slightly down and his attention on each task. He did not look toward the front of the house. He did not acknowledge the sky. Priya was standing at the dishwashing station with her headphones around her neck, which was the first time I had seen her without them on, and she was listening. Actively, consciously listening. I could see it in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her body. She was not scared exactly. She looked like someone monitoring something they understand but do not enjoy. I covered the mirrors. I came back to the dining room and began moving through the checklist with the careful, deliberate focus of someone who has decided that procedure is preferable to the alternative, which was understanding. The fluorescent lights I dimmed to their lowest setting. The television with its rhythmic static I left on, as Dina had indicated. I moved the 2 chairs in the waiting area so that nothing reflective, the chrome of the chair legs, was facing the north wall. The man at table 6 watched me do all of this. He watched with his hands flat on the table and his expression of patient waiting. He did not speak. At one point, moving past his table, I came within about 2 feet of him, and I felt, and I want to be precise about this, a change in air pressure. Not temperature. Pressure. Like standing near something very large that is displacing the air around it simply by existing. I moved to the counter. I picked up the logbook. I wrote, T6, Phase 2, palms flat, perimeter orientation, 2:41 a.m. As I wrote it, I noticed something about his coffee cup. I had refilled it. I was certain I had not refilled it after the clock stopped. There had been no moment where I had carried the pot to his table. I had a clear sense of that gap in my memory, the 23 minutes I couldn't account for. But the coffee in his cup was fresh. Full. Still visibly steaming. I set the logbook down. I went to the back and I asked Dina, quietly, whether she had refilled table 6's coffee. She was consulting a second document, older than the laminated card, a folded paper she had taken from her apron pocket, and she didn't look up. "No," she said. "I haven't been in the dining room." I said, "Warren?" She shook her head. "He hasn't left the kitchen." I went back to the dining room and stood behind the counter with the coffee pot in my hand, and I watched the man at table 6, and I tried to construct a logical framework in which someone had entered the dining room without me noticing, refilled his coffee, and exited. I could not do it. The dining room was too small and too well lit, and there was one entrance from the service corridor and one from the front door, which was locked, and I had been standing in the room. The sound through the north wall intensified at 3 a.m. Not the breathing rhythm, something deeper. Something that the word sound barely contains. It was pressure and vibration and a quality that I can only describe as directionality, a sense that whatever was producing it had a location, was moving from one point to another point, was not simply ambient. Warren appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me. He held up one hand flat, palm out. A gesture I understood, without being told, meant, stay where you are. Do not move. I stayed where I was. The man at table 6 slowly stood up. Section 7, Partial Revelation. He stood with the same patience he brought to everything. There was no urgency in it. He pushed the chair back with the careful deliberateness of someone in a library, or a church, a space where noise is treated as a form of consideration for others. He stood at the side of the table, and he was looking at the north wall, and I was looking at him. And for perhaps 30 seconds nothing moved in the diner except the very slight flicker of the lights and the rolling of the television static. He was taller than I had understood him to be. This sounds strange. I had seen him sitting in the same chair for weeks. But standing, he occupied the room differently. Not physically differently, not in any way that photography would capture. In the way that certain people occupy space differently from others when the context changes. He was wearing the same thing he always wore, dark slacks, a gray shirt, a jacket that was neither old nor new. Ordinary. Entirely ordinary. And yet standing in the dimmed light of the diner with his face turned toward the north wall, he was the most disquieting thing I had ever seen in a room, and I could not have explained why. Dina appeared beside me. She had come from the back corridor without a sound. She said very quietly, "Don't look at the wall when he does." I said, "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. She was watching him. Then she said, "Because you'll see what he's looking at." I looked at her instead of the wall. I studied her face in the dimmed fluorescent light, the years of composure in it, the specific professional neutrality that I had spent weeks misreading as simple managerial detachment. I understood, looking at her then, that it wasn't detachment. It was accommodation. The difference between someone who doesn't care about something and someone who has cared about it for so long that they have built an entire structural life around managing the caring. She had been doing this for 11 years. I said, "How long has he been coming here?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Before me." "Before Milo?" She didn't confirm or deny. She said, "The binders go back to 87. The records they were based on go back further. We don't have those. They weren't stored here." I asked where they were stored. "Different locations," she said. "There are other places. Other buildings that do what we do. Not many. Enough." She paused. "The point is the consistency. You have to maintain consistency. Same menu. Same table. Same service. You never skip a night. You never close early. You never change the routine." I asked why. She looked at me for the first time. Directly, without the layered professional distance. She said, "Because it keeps him here." I let that settle. "What happens?" I said carefully. "If he leaves?" She turned back to the dining room. The man at table 6 was still standing, still oriented toward the north wall. The sound through the wall had reached a steady intensity that I was starting to feel in my back teeth. "We don't know," she said. "It's never happened. The whole point is to make sure it never happens." This was, I think now, the most information Dina ever gave me in a single exchange. And it raised more questions than it answered, which I suspect was true of everything she had ever been told about the situation as well. I did not ask what he was. I could see from her face that she either didn't know or wouldn't say, and I had already intuited from the binders, from the decades of careful, consistent documentation, from the institutional framework built around a single table in a diner in central Ohio, that the people who had maintained this system had almost certainly stopped asking that question at some point. Not because they had found the answer. Because the question had become irrelevant next to the practical reality of management. The binders, I had noticed, contained no entry in any observational column for the nature or identity of the subject. There were decades of behavioral data. There was nothing that attempted to name or categorize what was being observed. This, I had come to understand, was not an omission. It was a decision. I looked into the dining room and I made the decision Dina had implicitly been warning me against. I looked at the north wall while he was looking at it. What I saw, and I want to be honest about the limits of language here, was not a visual event in any straightforward sense. The wall was the wall. Drywall over plaster over brick, water stains from a leak that had been patched but not repainted, the faint ghost of an old menu board that had been removed and painted over. These things were all still there and were visually unchanged. But there was a quality to the looking, to the act of directing my attention toward that wall in that moment, that I can only describe as dimensionality. As if the wall had depth it shouldn't have. Not like I could see through it. Like something on the other side was applying pressure to it. Like it was a surface that separated two things that were aware of each other. And then the man at table 6 turned his head. He was not looking at the wall anymore. He was looking at me. Not the patient, long-distance waiting expression of every night for weeks. He was looking at me with something that might, in a human face, have been called recognition. Or instruction. I looked away. When I looked back, he was sitting down. Chair pushed back in. Hands folded. Gaze on the middle distance. As though none of it had happened. I went to the back room. I opened the binder with my name on it. I pulled out one of the blank observation forms. I sat down at the break room table and I began filling in the columns, and as I did, I understood with a cold and settling certainty that this was why the form had been prepared. Not to trap me. Not to threaten me. The line at the bottom of the typed note came back to me, "She'll find this when she's ready." This was an invitation. A continuation of something that had been going on for decades before I arrived and would continue for decades after. Something that needed people who could perceive it accurately and document it carefully and maintain the conditions that kept whatever was in the storm anchored to a booth in the corner of a small diner in central Ohio. Something that had, apparently, decided I was suited for this work. I sat with the form in front of me and the pen in my hand, and I made the only irreversible decision available to me, which was whether to fill it in. I filled it in. Section 8, Final Storm. The largest storm came 4 nights later. I knew it was coming before it arrived, and not because of any barometric reading or visible change in the sky. I knew it the same way you know, sometimes, before you open a door, that the room behind it is different from the room you left. A quality of anticipation in the air. A pressure in the building itself that made the walls feel thin. Dina arrived at 9 p.m., 2 hours before my shift. This had never happened before. She was wearing different clothes than she typically wore to work, not a uniform but something plainer, darker. She checked every lock in the building, including the side service door and 2 interior locks I had not known existed until she used keys for them from a ring I had never seen on her belt. She was methodical and silent. Warren arrived at 10. He went directly to the kitchen and began a process I had not seen before, not cooking preparation but something closer to a systematic audit of the space. He checked every gas valve. He secured every cabinet. He disconnected the range hood motor entirely and taped over the switch. He worked without being asked to and without consulting any list, which told me he had done this before. Priya didn't come in. I noticed this at 11:30 and mentioned it to Dina. "She's on leave," Dina said, without further explanation. The man at table 6 arrived at midnight on the dot. He sat. He folded his hands. He ordered nothing. This was the first time in all the weeks I had known him that he ordered nothing, and I felt it in my sternum, The deviation from pattern, the break in the routine that Dina had said was the entire point. I looked at Dina. She had seen it. Her face was very still. I went to his table. I asked if he would like his usual. He looked at me. Not the middle distance. Me, he said. It's almost time. These were the first words I had ever heard him speak. His voice was not remarkable. It was the voice of an ordinary person. But the words themselves, the simplicity of them, the patient certainty, produced a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the understanding of scale. Almost time implies a timeline. Implies a duration. Implies something that has been building toward a moment, and that the moment is now proximate. I went back to the counter. I logged it, T6. Verbal. 0:08 a.m. It's almost time. The storm arrived at 1:19 a.m. There was no warning period. No gradual increase in wind or rain. The sky outside was simply clear, and then it was not. I was at the front window when it happened and I watched the change. The sky darkened from its normal dark to something deeper, something that the word dark barely contains, and then the cloud layer descended, visibly, rapidly, in a way that clouds do not move, and then the world outside the windows was white. Not the white of snowfall. White the way a monitor is white when nothing is being displayed. Uniform. Total. An absence of visual information. The sound through the north wall began immediately. Not the graduated intensification of previous nights, it was present at full force from the first moment, filling the building with the kind of pressure that makes you aware of your own skeleton. The electricity went next. Not a failure, it happened in stages, room by room, the way you might turn off lights in a house when preparing to leave. The kitchen first. Then the back corridor. Then the dining room fluorescence, which left only the emergency lighting, 2 dim battery-powered units near the exits that cast an orange-gray wash over everything. In this light, the diner looked like an entirely different place. The familiar surfaces, the vinyl booths, the counter, the pastry case, looked like the artifacts of an expired civilization. Dina moved through the dark with the confident navigation of someone who has memorized a path. She had a small flashlight, not a phone light but a real flashlight, the kind with a focus beam, and she moved with it in short arcs, checking things, verifying states, maintaining her checklist. She did not speak. The radio produced no signal of any kind. Not the rhythmic static of previous nights, absolute silence from the speaker. But the silence itself had a quality I hadn't encountered before. It was directional. It seemed to be coming from the speaker rather than simply being the absence of sound from the speaker. As though the radio was broadcasting silence. As though silence was the content. The man at table 6 stood. He walked to the north wall. He stopped approximately 1 foot from the surface, and he stood there with his back to the room. I was behind the counter. Dina was at the far end of the room. Warren had appeared in the kitchen doorway. We all watched. This was, I understood, the procedure: watch, document, maintain position. I was watching. I was watching the man at table 6 and the north wall and the dim terrible light, and I was maintaining position, and I was keeping my breathing regular, and I was absolutely not, looking at the wall in the same way I had looked at it 4 nights ago. Except that the wall moved. Not dramatically. Not like a movie wall. It moved the way skin moves over something alive underneath. A single, slow, pressurized movement, like an inhalation. The plaster did not crack. The paint did not chip. It moved, and then it stopped, and the pressure in the room dropped so suddenly that my ears popped. The man at table 6 placed his right hand flat against the wall. The sound stopped. Not gradually. Immediately. One moment it was present, the total, skeletal pressure, and then it was absent, and the absence was as physical as the presence had been. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, and then the full building power returned, the fluorescence cycling back on with the usual hum, the radio producing its usual late-night music, the refrigerator units kicking back on, the grill ticking in the kitchen as it returned to operating temperature. Normal sounds. Normal light. The sudden, jarring normality of a diner at 3 in the morning. The man at table 6 turned from the wall. He walked back to table 6. He sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at the middle distance. Outside the front windows, the sky was clear. Ordinary dark. Stars. No clouds. The white was gone. The storm was gone. The parking lot was empty and still, and the cracked asphalt was dry, as though it had never rained. Dina said quietly, to no one in particular, "Log the resolution time." The clock above the counter read 3:17 a.m. I picked up the logbook. I wrote T6. Perimeter contact. 3:17 a.m. Resolved. I stood there for a moment with the pen over the page. And then I went to table 6. The man was sitting with his hands folded. His coffee was full, hot, steaming, and the cherry pie was on the table in front of him, untouched. I had not brought him coffee or pie. I looked at the plate and the cup. I looked at him. I said very carefully, "Can I get you anything else?" He looked at me with the expression of patient waiting that I had come to know better than almost any other face in my life. He said, "Same time tomorrow." Section 9, Cold Aftermath. I left Milo's 4 weeks after the final storm. I want to be precise about why, because the easy explanation is that I was frightened and I ran, and that is not entirely accurate. I was frightened, yes. But the leaving was more deliberate than running. It was more like the decision to stop filling in the observation form, which I had ultimately decided not to do, that night in the break room, a decision I have thought about many times since. It was a decision about what kind of person I was willing to become in relation to something I didn't understand and couldn't control. A decision about participation. The weeks after the storm were, in some ways, the most unsettling weeks of my time at the diner. Not because of what happened, the storm was over, the records were gone, the procedures were over, but because of what didn't happen. Because of how completely and seamlessly the experience was absorbed back into the ordinary operations of the overnight shift. Dina was present every night, calm and efficient and correct. Warren cooked eggs and spoke his 40 words per shift. The man at table 6 arrived at varying hours, sat at varying times, ordered his coffee and pie, and left his $4 tip in exact cash. The lights hummed. The barometer read normally. The radio played its light rock and its county fair advertisements. I checked the secondary storage room on the Monday after the storm. The binders were there, all of them, in their correct positions. The black binder with my name was there. I opened it. The observation form I had partially filled in, the night of the standing event, was gone. Replaced with a fresh blank form, precisely positioned, ready to be completed. The logbook entry for the storm, all of my entries from that night, everything I had written during and after the event, was gone. Not erased. The pages had been replaced, the surrounding entries recopied in my own handwriting, the gap invisible to anyone who hadn't been there to write the original entries. I had my personal notebook. I had everything in the personal notebook. I kept it with me at all times after that, in my jacket pocket, checking its presence the way some people check their keys. I asked Dina, 3 days after the storm, about the logbook discrepancies. I asked directly, because by that point I had stopped pretending to accept the technically correct non-answers. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "The operational records need to be consistent with external records. For auditing purposes." I said, "Dina, I know that's not the reason." She held my gaze. Something moved through her expression, not quite guilt, not quite acknowledgement. Something in between. Then she said, "You've done well. You've been very careful. You understand things faster than most people who come through here." I said, "I don't want to be one of the people who comes through here." She was quiet for a moment. "You already are," she said gently, not threateningly. "The way you tell someone a fact they already know but haven't said out loud yet." I thought about M. Holston, the 1987 binder. I thought about the 4 different handwriting samples in the observation records across decades. I thought about the binder on the bottom shelf, prepared before I arrived, with my name already written on the spine. I thought about the line, "She'll find this when she's ready." Ready for what, exactly, I had been thinking about since the moment I read it. I think I understand now. Ready to see it clearly enough to document it accurately. Ready to be precise about something that most people's minds smooth over without noticing, the way the brain normalizes a repeated stimulus. Ready, in other words, to be useful. The station, as Dina had said, needed consistency. It needed people who could maintain the service, maintain the routine, keep the man at table 6 seated and supplied with coffee and pie and the particular atmosphere of a diner that has always been there and always will be. Whatever that routine accomplished, whatever the presence of this place, this table, this consistency, provided to whatever was outside the north wall during those storms, it required people who could see what was actually happening and continue performing their function anyway. I was not willing to be one of those people. This is the decision I made, and it cost me something, and I don't know what it cost the other side of the arrangement. On my last night, I did something I had not planned to do. I went to table 6 at the end of my shift, at 8 in the morning when the day crew was coming in and the light was changing and the parking lot was filling with the first ordinary customers of the day. The man was still there. He was always still there when I left. He stayed through the transition between shifts, apparently. He was sitting with his hands folded, his coffee fresh, the untouched pie on its plate. I stood beside the table. I said, "I'm not going to be here after tonight." He looked up at me. That patient recognition. He said, "Someone always is." I said, "I know." I put my apron on the counter and I took my personal notebook out of my pocket, and I walked out the front door. The parking lot was cold and bright and smelled like diesel and cut grass, and the drive back to my apartment took 40 minutes, and I spent most of those minutes not thinking about anything, the specific blank state that follows a decision that cannot be undone. I have been home for 3 months. I have checked the public meteorological records for the region every week. The standard weather system I mentioned at the beginning, the low-pressure front that passed through on the Wednesday into Thursday before the final storm, is the last recorded event for that area in that period. There is nothing in the NWS archive. There is nothing in any of the agricultural weather networks. There is nothing in the local news archive from that time, no power outages reported, no incidents, no unusual conditions. A storm large enough to do what I witnessed, producing weather behavior I cannot explain using any meteorological framework I understand, arrived and passed over a small town in central Ohio and left no record of itself anywhere. I still have my personal notebook. I have considered, many times, what to do with it. I have kept it because the records in it are accurate, and because accuracy feels like the only form of resistance I have access to. I have also considered that the records in it may not be fully reliable, that the memory gaps I experienced during the storm events may have introduced errors I can't detect. That some of what I wrote may be a record of what I thought I saw rather than what I saw. I don't know how to determine the difference. I dream about the diner. Not nightmare dreams, I want to be clear about that. Quiet dreams. Dreams where I am standing behind the counter at 3 in the morning with the coffee pot in my hand and the fluorescence humming and the television running its low-volume static, and everything is ordinary and procedural and there is the specific, contained piece of a building that exists outside the main current of time. In these dreams I know what the sound through the north wall is. I know exactly what is outside, pressing its slow and patient presence against the wall. I wake up and the knowledge is gone, replaced with the sense of having almost known something. The man at table 6 is still there. I am confident of this. The diner is still open, 24 hours, every day. Someone is making coffee. Someone is slicing pie. Someone is logging arrival times and temperature readings and the phases of behavior at table 6 in the observation forms in the black binder on the bottom shelf. New binder now, with a new name on the spine. Someone is maintaining the consistency. Someone is keeping the routine, because the routine is the point, because the routine is what keeps whatever is outside the north wall anchored and contained and present in a specific place rather than elsewhere. I think about that sometimes. The elsewhere part. I think about what it means that this system exists, that someone built it, or inherited it, or was recruited into it in the way I was recruited, and what it implies about the number of things in the world that are being managed in similar ways, in other buildings, on other routes, in other towns that have a small procedural wrongness embedded in their ordinary life. I think about whether the storms occur elsewhere when there is no such arrangement to anchor them. I think about whether the man at table 6 is the arrangement, or is the thing being arranged. I think about the fact that I filled in one observation form, partially, and about what, if anything, that means about my relationship to the system now. I have not been back to Milo's. I have not driven past it. I have not contacted Dina or Warren. I do not know if they are still there. I have told 2 people what I experienced, and neither of them believed me, which is understandable, and neither of them believed me in the specific way that told me they hadn't really heard what I was saying, that the mind skips over certain things the same way it skips over repeated stimuli, smoothing them out, filing them under stress or imagination, or that's not how weather works. I know how weather works. I have 3 months of barometric readings in a personal notebook to prove that I was paying attention. The readings before the final storm should not be possible. I've checked. The last thing I will say is this. There is a specific quality to the silence that followed the storm, the post-event silence of a building returning to itself, the hum of the fluorescents, and the soft cycling of the refrigerators and the distant sound of a car somewhere on the road. I have been trying to put it into words for 3 months, and the closest I can get is patient. The silence felt patient. As though it was waiting, without urgency, for the next time. And somewhere in that small town in central Ohio, in a diner with a burned-out letter in its sign and 40 years of observation binders in a secondary storage room, a man is sitting at table 6 with his hands folded and his coffee going cold, watching the middle distance, and waiting for the sound through the north wall to begin again. Same time tomorrow. Same time as always.